Hi, Andy.
Hi, Victoria.
So it's good to see you on Zoom. We are at home, sheltered at home like the rest of the country.
And I believe the subject today is going to be fasting and fasting-mimicking diets. We're going to be talking to Dr. Valter Longo.
Yes, and I know that you have been interested in fasting, but also have sometimes been a little doubtful about fasting. I'm wondering if you could tell our audience your thoughts.
Well, I have been fascinated by the growing attention in the scientific community and lay community, intermittent fasting, and about that for resetting metabolism. And the challenge, I think, is to find a practical way of doing that.
So it'll be fantastic to have our guest, Dr. Valter Longo, who is really one of the leading researchers, and he is going to take us through the various kinds of fasting and some of the research he's done on something called fasting-mimicking diets.
Yeah, which looks to me like the most practical taking advantage of the benefits of fasting.
All right, let's go to Valter. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Valter Longo. He is the director of the Longevity Institute at the University of Southern California, and he also directs the Longevity Center and Cancer Program in Milan, Italy. He's written a bestseller, The Longevity Diet, and really he's perhaps one of the best-known researchers around the world looking at fasting. Hi, Valter. We are so delighted to have you on our show. Many of our listeners will be familiar with fasting from a religious perspective. In the Jewish religion, people fast for up to 25 hours on Yom Kippur. Ramadan has a fast that goes from dawn until sunset, so it varies depending on what month it comes out, but usually 11 to 16 hours. People fast on Lent, and that's a very different fast. That's giving up meat, whereas the Jewish fast is nothing, no food, no water. So when you think about fasting, what does it mean?
Well, I always say that fasting, it's kind of like saying eating doesn't really mean anything. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's being used very loosely like that. Mm-hmm. But let's say that the main methods, fasting-associated methods, are what's called time-restricted eating, mm-hmm. which refers to anywhere from 12 hours of water-only fasting to about 16, 20 hours, right? The mm-hmm. most you see usually is about 20 hours. And something else is called alternate day fasting. Alternate day fasting is just that. Eat one day, don't eat on the other day, or have a low-calorie or very low-calorie diet on the alternate day. And then there's something called 5-2. There are different versions of that. And the 5-2 refers to either 1 day a week or 2 days a week. 2 days a week of either consecutive or non-consecutive fasting days. And it could be, again, fasting, or it could be, let's say, 500 calories of different composition. And then what we've been focusing on is what we call periodic fasting and or fasting-mimicking diets, which is something that you don't necessarily have to do in an intermittent fashion, but it's more on a need-to-do-it basis. So you do it when you need to do it. And that refers to longer periods of fasting. It could be 2, 3, 4 days, all the way to 1 week, at least in the way we've been testing it clinically. We started with cancer patients with water-only fasting and then moved to fasting-mimicking composition, which I'm assuming we're going to talk about.
Yes, we will talk about it. Andy, I know you've experimented a bit with fasting. Can you tell our listeners about your experience?
Yeah, it goes back a long way. In the 1970s, I experimented with water fasting for several days, especially to see what the effect on consciousness was. So I would do a 3-day water-only fast. And my initial experience was that on the second day, I really felt awful, both mentally and physically. And on the third day, I felt great, just really high, and my mind worked at peak efficiency. Very interesting. But then I found it very difficult to come off of that in a sensible fashion. And I would find myself overeating tremendously at the end of it. Then I'd appeared somewhere in the, I think, early or late 1970s, I was in a pattern of fasting 1 day a week. So that meant, I think I did it on Mondays, I would have water only. And that just seemed like, to me, a good discipline. I think I did it mostly as a spiritual discipline more than for any physical effects. As the information began to come out about the benefits of intermittent fasting, I was very fascinated by that. I had a number of friends who were doing it and reporting great effects with it. I tried various schedules of doing it. First compressing my period of eating to 6 hours or 8 hours. The problem, I would find myself ravenously hungry when I did eat, and I would probably eat more than I would normally would if I weren't doing that. So that just didn't work. I tried other schedules, also had the same problem. But I've been very interested in the possibility of fasting mimicking diet. So that really drew me to Valter Longo's work.
So from an evolutionary biology perspective, what's the role that fasting plays?
Yes, fasting has been around forever, right? So from the very beginning, most organisms on Earth are starving all the time, and once in a while they get lucky and they get some food and they go back to starving. This is true for most bacteria, for most microorganisms, and this was also true for us. Most likely we got food once in a while, probably periods during the summer where we had food all the time, but then we certainly, almost undoubtedly, most of our ancestors had long periods of starvation very frequently. And they could be fairly long periods, So, for example, we believe that the summer was the moment where, the insulin resistance was generated and fat will be stored so that then you could get through the winter using the fat stored during the summer. And now we're forgetting these evolutionary issues. We come from a starving world, every organism. This is how I got started with fasting, because I was starving bacteria and they were living a lot longer. I was starving yeast, the baker's yeast, and they were living a lot longer. And they also became very strong. You could hit it with toxins and they would not die. And that's when I thought, if bacteria, prokaryotes and eukaryotes have this in common, this must be really about all organisms. And sure enough, I think it was.
Body of Wonder is produced by the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona, internationally recognized for innovative health and wellness programs, evidence-based research, and clinical standards. During this unprecedented time managing the physical and emotional challenges of the coronavirus, the Andrew Weil Center is here to support you. The center offers listeners a wide range of free resources to live and maintain a healthy lifestyle, including online learning, meditations, and short videos. To find out more, go to azcim.org/podcast. That's azcim.org/podcast.
So I think a lot of people have that challenge that they don't feel great when they fast. I mean, I know people who they love to fast and they say things sometimes like, "Oh, I forgot to eat." I never forget to eat a meal. I'm hungry at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so fasting is not easy for me. And I often feel weak when I fast. And yet I certainly know people, and I sometimes think they're the Vata type from the tradition of the Ayurvedic. They're tall and thin and airy, and they just seem to have a really easy time with fasting. So I'm curious, Valter, what your experience has been with people's ease or difficulty. And I know it's the difficulty side that had you develop the fasting mimicking diet. So maybe you could address both those.
Yes, it's the difficulty side, but also the safety side and compliance. So when we first started, 10, 12 years ago, with the clinical trials on cancer here at USC and water-only fasting and cancer, we thought, of course, everybody's going to do it, even if they have a possibility of doing better, having less side effects. And we were wrong. Nobody wanted to do it. And the oncologists struggled to get people to be on it. And so, we went back then to the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, and basically asked for funds to develop a fasting mimicking diet. That was a very good idea, again, both for compliance and safety. Now we publish a number of trials on this, and this year we're going to publish 3 or 4 more. And the compliance, if done with a registered dietitian in the cancer setting, is, let's say, the minimum we see is 70-80%, all the way to 90-95% compliance. even going many cycles. And the other thing is safety and the let's say lean body mass loss, the loss of muscle. This has been at the beginning, it was a true war with the oncologist, but then I think they realized that there was a lot of science there, and we were trying to address exactly that. We didn't want anybody to become cachectic and lose muscle mass and become frail. And sure enough, now we're about to publish that that's not the case, meaning that patients, even if they're doing all kinds of cancer therapies, going from chemotherapy to immunotherapy to hormone therapy, they can maintain a normal weight. Now, sometimes we do exclude patients from the trials because they do lose weight and they cannot regain it. I would say it's a very small percentage of patients where, in fact, we were surprised how small it has been. So for those reasons, I think it's good to start thinking about standardizing fasting in a way that the medical community, fasting, as Dr. Weil knows, has been around for a long time. And even in the medical community, every 50 years or so, it arises and then it disappears, right? And it disappears because you see as many benefits as problems. So I think it's really important to standardize it and to test, specific fasting-mimicking diets for specific purposes.
I've been fascinated by the literature on very successful treatment of autoimmune conditions with long-term water fasting. Really interesting reports of total remission of rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, some forms of asthma on long-term water fasting. Obviously, it has to be done under supervision, and the problem is that the conditions tend to come back, once eating is resumed. And the question is whether you could find some way of transitioning from that that would maintain the remission.
Yes, absolutely. So unfortunately, those trials always show, if first of all, let's say you do 2 or 3 weeks of water-only fasting, that's extremely tough. And most doctors will tell you that should only be done in a clinic, which then makes it very expensive. Yep. And now, so the recommendation would be go to a clinic, do 2 or 3 weeks of this, and then it's going to come back anyway. And so, and this is, as you know, old studies. This was published in Lancet, 30 years ago or whatever. And then it never made it into mainstream medicine. It was because, there was no idea. And in fact, I think it was mentioned in the paper, this is likely to come back after you finish the diet. So, we try to turn that. Now we finished a trial on multiple sclerosis with the FMD, fasting-mimicking diet. Now we're doing 3 or 4 more trials. Stanford has just started with IBD and the fasting-mimicking diet. And, we have multiple sclerosis and other conditions. So hopefully rheumatoid arthritis will also be in our one of our targets. And so we'll see what happens. But the idea would be, let's say, in our trial, we do 7 days of a fasting-mimicking diet that comes in a package, and the patient will do it every 2 months. So it's 7 days every 2 months. So if that worked and it kept the autoimmunity in check, then now it becomes, I think, reasonable and feasible for lots of patients. Maybe not everybody, but certainly lots of the patients that have these conditions.
Can you help us understand how you formulated the fasting mimicking diet? I will tell our listeners that I did it and I found it much, much easier than water fasting. Of course, it's structured, so you know exactly what you're going to eat. But is it that it's low calorie? Is it that it's feeding a certain part of the microbiome? How do you explain, one, how you put it together so it actually mimics not eating at all, a water fast, and 2, what you think the mechanism is by which it's having this effect on the immune system?
So first of all, believe it or not, the foundation of this it goes back almost 30 years to the days where I was with Walford and Steve Clark at UCLA and looking at starving bacteria, starving people, starving yeast. And so we realized a long, long time ago the connection between certain nutrients and certain genes, right? So, for example, certain amino acids and TOR, acid kinase, certain amino acids and growth factors like IGF-1, growth hormone, certain carbohydrates, specifically sugars, and PKA. So I'm just throwing out names, but these are names of what we call what we are now viewing, not just me, but many of us, as master or central regulators of aging. So what does that mean? Like, for example, these protein response pathways, these genes that respond. So if you eat lots of protein, IGF-1 levels will go up. And now this IGF-1 is recognized by many of us as a central regulator of the aging process, to the point that if you knock out the growth hormone IGF-1 axis in mice, they will live 50% longer. But more importantly, they will have much, much lower level of diseases, right? So they live longer and they have less diseases. And then in our studies of people in Ecuador, they have the same type of mutation. So it's almost like if they never ate proteins, but they, of course, eat proteins, but they don't have the genes that respond to them. And they're very much protected from cancer, diabetes. So far, we and others in Europe have shown these effects. So this seems like these genes that regulate aging in simple organisms also regulate aging in humans. So anyways, the diet, the formulation is based on the understanding of this. So how do I regulate growth hormone, IGF-1, TOR, PKA? What's the formulation that's going to do that? And how do I do it in a way that is feasible and in a way that promotes also other changes? For example, microbiota, the growth of lactobacillus bifidobacteria in the gut. How do I also make sure that the patient don't become hypotense, hypoglycemic? So we've been thinking for decades about a lot of issues that we try to solve. And so the end result should be you get a package, with or without the physician, maybe a registered dietitian follows you, and the great majority of people will not have side effects and will benefit from it. And also while minimizing the burden of having to do a water-only fasting. I've done water-only fasting once, and I think it's the last time I'll ever do that. I really struggled. And so I remember there was maybe 10 years ago, I said, I'm never going to do this again. And I remember every part of it. And of course, some people do it with no problems. So I'm not saying that everybody's going to have that reaction, but I would say lots of people would struggle with water-only fasting.
The food mimicking diet has lots of regular things in it. I mean, there's soups that are made from vegetables, and there's nuts in a bar. So it's it feels like things you'd see in a regular, maybe healthy diet. Obviously, lower total volume and lower calorie than one might normally consume. But somehow you're saying this particular mixture alters the microbiome and is a low enough load that it alters the immune regulation. Yeah.
So, for example, if you look at our recent mouse study, and I also included a clinical component, but we had an IBD, inflammatory bowel disease model, right? So we give severe inflammation to the mice, intestinal inflammation to the mice. And then if you look at water-only fasting together with the toxin, the gut of the mice becomes even more leaky during fasting. And it makes sense, right? The fasting, basically the signal to the intestine is there is no food, so you don't need to be as densely populated with cells. But with the fasting-mimicking diet, we didn't see that. We saw a higher degree of protection, and we saw also stem cells being increased in the gut and inflammation being decreased. So it seems like the FMD is giving fuel, prebiotic ingredients to the lactobacillus bifidobacteria, and is also giving a signal to the gut to don't overdo the breakdown process, because there's still food here. So that was important. And where do the ingredients come from? The ingredients also come from Andrew Weil's book, and certainly I made it a point in having a common denominator. So if you look at epidemiology, if you look at the centenarian studies, if you look at the basic research on longevity, what are some of the ingredients that we keep coming up as positive? So then the effort was made. Let's pick only ingredients that are clearly beneficial to longevity and health span. that was a good idea because some of it we didn't learn until later. So for example, the FMD was formulated before showing that, in fact, the lactobacillus and some of the protective microbes would benefit from those ingredients.
Andy, you've talked about the possible downsides of having a really robust immune system. And we're certainly seeing that with coronavirus when people have cytokine storm. Do you think people should be fasting now?
I'm glad you asked him that question.
I don't guess, Mike. Valter, let me make a comment first. Clearly the 1918 flu was even more provocative at causing a cytokine storm, and most people died of that. And that selectively killed young, healthy people that had the most robust immune systems. So we're not seeing that with COVID-19. But I think in that kind of situation, you would want to down-regulate the immune system. And it makes me nervous when I hear people casually talking about boosting immunity and enhancing immunity without realizing that there's a downside to that. But I'd like to hear Valter's opinion. Maybe fasting and fasting-mimicking diet modulates immunity in a desirable way that would protect you.
Yeah, so in mice, it definitely does. So we also receive grants both from the NIH, the NIA, and from a foundation in Italy to do the clinical trial for the flu, right? So a response to the flu vaccine, but we haven't started the trials, either one of them yet. So we don't know. And I think that's the answer. We don't know because as Andrew pointed out, if you have a inflammatory response that is too high, you could have a problem. Now with coronavirus, the problem seems to be this pneumonia. And what are the reasons for that? And then what do patients actually die from? Do they die from sepsis? Do they die from the inflammatory response? So I think we need a lot more, people looking at clinically and preclinically at this specific virus. And I hope we come up with a system that's much more rapid so that, by the time everybody's infected, we already have a solution rather than talking about the next 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
A practical problem at the moment is that with all of us in lockdown, overeating seems to be the major problem. And I know several people who have been doing intermittent fasting who've given it up in the past few weeks because they find it very hard to regulate their food intake.
Yeah, so the recommendation has been, if you're at home, you're isolated, you have really low exposure, low chance of being exposed, let's say you can stay at home for the next week. I think the fasting-mimicking diet is a very good, or other types of, let's say, shorter fasting is a very good time to do it. And to also counteract counterbalance any overfeeding that most people are doing at home. So, but I would say medical personnel or anybody that has somebody infected around, I would tell them, no, don't fast. It's not a good time to. I mean, there is a slight decline in white blood cells when you fast. There is some type of redistribution. There were recently several papers in the journal Cell looking at the tremendous effect of fasting, following our own papers, a number of our own papers. But they confirmed this tremendous effect of fasting in redistributing all kinds of immune cells. So some cells go from the periphery to the bone marrow, some cells do the opposite, some cells die, some stem cells are setting up, hematopoietic stem cells are setting up to generate new white blood cells. So it's a very complex set of changes. And I think, luckily we are funded to test this clinically. So let's see what happens in this flu trial. And hopefully, as soon as there is a COVID-19 vaccine, then we're going to do the same with COVID-19. So we do the 2 cycles. This is in the summer, 2 cycles of the fasting-mimicking diet, followed by the vaccine. And then we look at the antibody formation, the antibody titer is called. And then we follow the actual infection rate. Do they get the flu? And then so if so, how bad is it, and what are the consequences?
I have a question I'd really be interested to hear your opinion on. It's a little bit off the subject. You mentioned that you had studied with Wolford. Roy Wolford, I knew him well when he was sealed up in the biosphere here. And he was a major proponent of caloric restriction, practiced this himself and predicted that he was going to live to some great age. And he died far short of that degenerative disease. Around the same time, I had seen a number of patients that caught my attention of fairly young, ultra athletes who had ALS. So early onset ALS and relatively young people who were extreme exercisers had no body fat. And it made me wonder whether, with caloric restriction, I'm sure you get great improvement in cardiovascular health. And maybe that's the major gain that extends longevity. But I wonder if that's at the possible expense of neurological.
Yeah. So I think that the big disadvantage that Roy had was that it was too early for the molecular biology, it was too early for the genetics, et cetera, et cetera. We had a huge advantage, because, having the genes and having, for example, know that we did this both in mice and humans, these genes that I was just talking about, mutation in the growth hormone pathway, they improve cognitive function in both humans and mice. So we looked at these Ecuadorians with growth hormone receptor deficiency, and they were cognitively younger. They were about maybe 10, 15 years younger, really impressive. And the mice very much cognitively improved. Now, if you look at the fasting-mimicking diet, our first publication was actually showing that improvement in cognitive delay in cognitive decline in the mice doing the FMD. Pretty soon we're going to publish on humans on the FMD with fMRIs. Yeah, so if anything, that is one of the things that we hear from people. My cognition, I was so much clearer. I could remember things better. I was much sharper. So, we have seen that. Now, this is very different from calorie restriction. This is why I learned a lot from being in Walter's lab for 2 years, but I never worked on calorie restriction because I was there in Arizona when they came out of Biosphere 2, and they looked terrible. Yeah. And there was, I just got started in the lab a year earlier, I think, and I thought this doesn't look promising. It just looks like we have to find a way. How do we get all the benefits without causing all the problems? And like you say, the fats, and we see this also in mice. I mean, most people don't know that about a third of the mice genetic background, if you take all kinds of genetic background, about a third of them will benefit from chronic calorie restrictions. So let's say eating 25, 30, 40% less all the time. So a third of the mice will benefit greatly. A third will get no neutral effects, and a third will die earlier, right? And those that die earlier seems to be the one that have less fat storing capacity. And so this is also consistent with the idea that people that have a little bit extra weight in their 70s and 80s, they tend to do better. Right? They're not morbidly obese, but those that seem to have, say, a BMI of 26. It's not so bad for older people. Yeah, so absolutely. Calorie restriction was a pioneering intervention, very interesting, but we're in a completely different world when we do FMD. And in fact, we recommend the prolonged FMD maybe 3 times a year for 5 days. So this would be, 15 days in the entire year, right? So, I say, people, if they don't need to, they shouldn't do it more than that. This is not about I do it as much as possible so I get more benefit. You do it 3 times and that's it. Unless, you have diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. Now we have 4 clinical trials on diabetes right now. We'll see soon enough what the results are. But we already have data on pre-diabetes, and it worked very well with the pre-diabetes patients. So I think that is the way to do it. Is that don't overdo it. Don't do what Walter did. Don't push yourself to the limit. And also the monkeys. If you look at the calorie restriction studies in monkeys, both in Wisconsin and at the National Institute on Aging, the benefits on overall mortality. So how long did they live? Were not that good. Now they had in Wisconsin, the monkeys that were calorie restricted all the time, they had a tremendous effect on diabetes, tremendous effect on cancer and cardiovascular disease. But overall lifespan was not that much longer. And in the NIA, the National Institute on Aging, there was no difference in longevity, right? So I think we need to move from that to where we're going. And by the way, I don't make a penny out of all of this. I donate 100% of everything to charity and to research. So I want to make sure people know that I'm not advertising in fact, I don't even take consulting from any company related to this.
Well, that's great to hear, Valter. I think that's very sensible advice, and it feels very doable, unlike the other systems that I've seen out there.
I do think it's doable to do something, 2 or 3 times a year where you are, changing your habits significantly. Any gender differences, men versus women?
Very little. Some. I think we're gonna start. We're gonna publish later this year another trial on hypertension and prediabetes on diabetes. And I have to say there are some differences, but they're nothing significant, or just in a few cases. But overall, I say we measure like 100 different things, and most of them seem to be fairly similar between male and female. But as we get more and more data, I think we're probably going to see differences, sex specific.
Do you find that following a fasting mimicking diet ends up changing people's relationships to food?
Yes, so this is one of the most impressive things that we see with lots of people. And it may be in part because it's only 5 days. And even in the clinical trials, we give them this box, they do it for 5 days, and we give them no rules about the rest of the time. And we see that most people, especially if they do it after they do it 2, 3, 4 times, then they begin to say, in a completely voluntary manner, starting to change my habit. For example, if I never ate vegetables, now that I've been exposed to, let's say, 15, 20 days of this vegan diet, I am much more prone to appreciate eating more vegetables or eating less meat, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say the great majority of people eventually undergo this process of change. And, in science, there is something called food aversion. So when the patient may reject a certain type of food because they associate that food with some pain. For example, chemotherapy, right? So if you combine chemotherapy with a certain food ingredient, eventually you may reject that ingredient. We're starting to think that may be the opposite, that you now have certain vegan ingredients that make you feel a lot better. And if you never had those and you start, eating them more during the prolonged FMD, now eventually your brain is telling you, I need more of those because I felt so much better when I was under those.
So a closing question. You are both really passionate about healthy aging. And besides fasting or a fasting mimicking diet, I'd love to hear from each of you some practical recommendations that you could give to our listeners about how they can live a long, healthy life. Andy, let's start with you.
Well, I have always cited the MacArthur Foundation's report on successful aging, and the two common factors that they found in the population that they studied were maintenance of physical activity throughout life and maintenance of social and intellectual connectedness. So I think in addition to sensible nutrition, I would say those two are really important.
And it seems like during this time of the coronavirus, certainly social interactions being challenged.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I usually have, my recipe, and again, I like to use the 5 pillars of longevity: epidemiological study, clinical, basic research, centenarian study, and studies of complex systems. And so that leads to, I think, a pescatarian diet, fish maybe a couple times a week, plus vegan. I don't like the vegan, and in talking to lots of people that have been studying the vegans, they tend to do worse than the vegetarians and worse than the pescatarians. And it may have to do with the immune system, may have to do with malnourishment, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't mean that you cannot be vegan and very healthy. It just means that most people that are vegan are probably, kind of like the calorie restriction. They may have lots of benefits and lots of problems.
Valter, one thing I like to ask our guests is, we're talking about health and health promotion and long life. I always like to ask people what their one guilty pleasure is.
I have many.
You can share more than one if you want.
But if it was up to me, I would eat sweets all day long. But I'm very good, and so I narrow it down to now 85% cocoa chocolate every night. So I'm happy with that. That's the thing, right? If you do it long enough with the good food and you eat good food, then you start appreciating less and less the sort of the junk type of food. So now I'm very happy with that, and I don't feel as I used to There is something in Italy that's called panettone, right? So it's lots of saturated fats, but it's great. And so I used to dream of panettone all the time. Now a little bit less. Yeah.
Valter, thank you so very much for being on with us. And I think that you've shared a lot of really valuable information that people are going to find very, very interesting. So thank you.
Pleasure to meet you virtually, Valter.
Yeah.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Listeners, this is Dr. Victoria Maizes. We would love for you to send us your questions for Andy, myself, or for our guests. You can call us and leave a voicemail by dialing 520-621-3950. Again, 520-621-3950. Or you can submit a question by going to our website, azcim.org/podcast. Again, azcim.org/podcast. We will review your questions and try to answer as many as possible on our programs.
Learn more about topics featured on the Body of Wonder podcast and how to apply them to your everyday health with My Wellness Coach, a free mobile app from the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine. Download today at mywellnesscoach.arizona.edu. That's mywellnesscoach.arizona.edu.